the chat room?
Sorry.
Very good. I have a couple of preliminaries. The first one is a different land acknowledgement. Not every encounter between peoples in history need be colonial or genocidal. What became Southern Ontario, for instance, exhibited 1,000 years of peace through mutually beneficial language and culture contact between the Mississaugas, the earliest occupants of this land, and the people who asked the Mississaugas permission to settle here around 600 AD, called the Ayawat in Mississauga. Now we know them as the Huron-Wendat. For about a millennium, these two nations lived complementary lives until the Europeans arrived, bringing disease, competition over resources and trade, war, religion, and dispersal of one of the nations, the Wendat. All of this is known through recently published oral history by a Mississauga elder scholar. So acknowledging that this land at different times has seen great indigenous peace and disastrous colonial war is part of coming to grips with our topic today. I also should talk about my own relationship to this question. We need to engage with how our lives have been shaped by colonialism and colonial violence and unspeakable suffering that was inflicted upon people by other people who spoke colonial languages. And we should not be tempted to think that these days are over and that everyone agrees that taking away people's land and resources without their informed prior consent is wrong. But that would ignore the fact that the consequences of colonialism are nothing short of the very world that we live in, with the social disadvantages which colonialism created, upheld by the doctrine of discovery and imperial ideology, and colonial ideologies about land and law and language, fueled by a systemic racism, which has greatly profited the colonizers, and therefore which underpins the Canadian state, and may I say, severely compromises the honor of the Crown in Canada, and therefore it harms all of us. My knowledge of colonialism comes from an eye-opening experience that I had as an Ontario civil servant as a young man a long time ago before I came to Glendon. I was called Assistant Language Training Officer in the Ministry of Citizenship. And my responsibility was to oversee policy for all adult education in the province in terms of second language learning for immigrants, French programs for Franco-Ontarian adults, and adult education for Indigenous peoples in the province. I was surprised at the last responsibility because as a middle-class son of one of Canada's leading children's educators, and having attended the best private boys' school in Toronto, I had been taught that Indians had faded away after they helped defend Canada from American attack in the War of 1812, and that we wouldn't have an independent country without them, and that we should be grateful for their sacrifice, period. Nothing much about them since 1812 in the history books. And then my first week on the job with the Ministry of Citizenship, and you can ask why are Indigenous people under the Ministry of Citizenship, but anyway, my first week on the job, I'm assigned to spend a month in Anishinaabe Aski Nation. It was called Grand Council Treaty Number 9 in Northern Ontario, to find out in each community what its adult education needs would be for the upcoming year. I was given a plane and a pilot and a month. Let's say that I came out of that month a very different person than when I went in. And actually that different person and the person giving this talk are the same. Another preliminary, maybe you've had a chance to view Professor Lesley Marcom's TEDx talk at Queen's. Her talk is a succinct synopsis from an indigenous linguist and activist, both in the university and in the Kingston community. But I'd like to draw your attention to 3 points which Professor Marcom makes. Number one, there's no reconciliation without the survivance of Indigenous languages. And here the idea of survivance, which I understand have been first used by % of Indigenous people in Canada preserved. And three, we need support. people wanting. My third preliminary has to do with support, allyship, and the decolonization path. Walking the decolonization path is always a from various degrees of closeness to various degrees of openness. Going from being unaware of colonial complicity, I was there too, to emergent awareness. From aware but personally disconnected to personally connected. From connected but without responsibilities, connected and responsible. From responsible but passive to responsible and active. From active but unengaged and alone to active and engaged with others. To be engaged but only sectionally. For example, a linguist might only be interested in the language itself. To being engaged intersectionally and holistically. At each of my little asterisks, something extraordinary has to happen. Perhaps you take a course which includes decolonization or indigenization. Or perhaps Tom King gets into your head with one of his stories, or the new film showing at TIFF this week. And whatever else you may do, you can't get over it. You can retell it, you can cry, you can forget it, but you can no longer say that you didn't hear it. So what are we up against on this path? It should be actually more a canoe path, I think, because I'm seeing Roz on the screen. And the idea is the wind is not, and it never is when you're in a canoe. The wind is never at your back. It's blowing right in your face. And it's been blowing in our faces for 500 years. What is this wind? The whole European nation state and imperial scheme, in which siempre la lengua es la compañera del imperio, and the King's English is imposed on all vernaculars and minorities. Monolingualism reigns, literally. The second, England learned to be a violent colonial power at home. The idea of Britishness came with a very strong quasi-racial antipathy to all Celtic peoples and Catholics. Just ask any Irish person, but there's a hint. Be prepared for a long conversation. And three, there's a cast of mind, an epistemological, how do we know anything, and ontological, what is the essence of things, a framework that English Protestant modernity developed around land and language. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Locke. He actually met some indigenous people. They were Penobscots in London and got very nervous when he discovered that they didn't have a word in their language for 1,000. Well, a word about language. Locke, as seen by the Canadian philosopher of language, Charles Taylor. The colonial view of language was based on notions of the superiority of European civilization and language as opposed to non-European. But it was also grounded in a very limited notion of what Charles Taylor calls the human linguistic capacity. The idea of language as merely a representational system for ideas, the Locke, Hobbes, and Condillac cognitive utilitarian view of language, synchronizes with Locke's view of the proper use of land, to work it so that profit can be derived from it. That is what land is about. And the view goes like this. This is Locke's view of language. In the mind, there are ideas, bits of representation of reality. Knowledge consists in having that representation square with reality. But we need a responsible procedure, a method to do so. And language gives us the key. Words allow us to combine ideas into a responsible picture. Language allows us to classify bits of reality into synthetic wholes rather than be limited to particulars. Abstract and abstract concepts are good. Language is an instrument of transmission of ideas among individuals. It's an instrument. Its purpose is not to protect one's linguistic or cultural identity, but to overcome obstacles to achieving successful linguistic interactions, which may aid in gaining rights, freedoms, or economic opportunities. Questions of marginalization or oppression or loss of intergenerational transmission of culture from one's parents are absent in a Lockean framework, since effectively carrying out the communicative function of language is paramount. And the common dominant language, the most efficient, is the most efficient. And the state should not produce policies which impedes citizens' access to the common language. Hint, by the way, it begins with a capital E and ends in SH. State monolingualism is the most logical and beneficial for individual freedom. And Lockean views on land in Ireland and the Americas, very similar. A productive liberal order is required in both places. We've seen that Irish and Scots had been driven off their land for not exploiting it sufficiently. And the colonization of Ireland was justified by the assertion that, quote, the Irish would never, to the end of the world, build a house or improve the land as it ought to be, said Sir John Davies, who oversaw the colonization of Ireland. The idea was crystallized in the 17th century political thinker's view by John Locke, who held that the ownership of land belonged only to those who improved its productivity. Indigenous land was seen by the early settlers as being wasted, and therefore it was virtuous to seize Aboriginal land, if by so doing, the land would be rendered more productive. This is the analysis, brilliant, monumental analysis by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So from a Lockean perspective, the English were duty-bound to carry on their civilizing mission, both in Ireland and the Americas. I'd now like to draw on a very foundational work by Professor Ian McKay, who is the Wilson Chair of Canadian History at McMaster, called The Liberal Order Framework, a Theory of Canada. McKay's thesis holds that the category Canada should henceforth denote a historic, not a country, but a historically specific project of rule, rather than either an essence we must defend or an empty homogeneous space we must possess. Canada as project can be analyzed through the study of the implantation and expansion over a heterogeneous terrain of a certain politico-economic logic, to wit, liberalism. Its prior epistemological and ontological status to the individual who truly exists in a way that society or community do not exist, of that view. But the individual, Locke's individual, is not to be confused with actually living beings. So many in mid-Victorian Canada were excluded from the vote, such as non-owners of property, other races, and unassimilated Amerindians. And McKay on mid-Victorian liberalism and Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples' conceptions of property, politics, and the individual were scandalously not derived from the universe of Locke. And therefore, being pre-liberal and pre-modern and non-capitalist and non-white, they were to be despised. The transcontinental project of rule, though, required that these indigenous alternative logics be subordinated to the fulfillment of liberal norms. Otherwise, the Canadian project would be seen as contingent and its claimed sovereignty unsubstantial. And so, and this is a terrible quote, but I have to give it to you. It was perhaps in the residential schools that the full utopianism of a vanguard liberalism came to the fore. For within these Christian liberal manufactories of individuals, preeminent laboratories of liberalism, First Nations children were forced to be free in the very peculiar liberal sense of free, even at the cost of their lives. But there was another European view of language, and Charles Taylor holds up against Locke's designative and individualistic view of language the frameworks of Johann Herder and Wilhelm von Humboldt, whose view of language he terms constitutive. In this view, language is seen as constitutive of a situated form of life and understanding through what we would call today an ecological lens, in which its onto-epistemology would be unified and relational, connecting people and peoples to places and ecosystem services which support ecological flourishing, forms of life in their particular environmental circumstances. It's this view, Taylor asserts, which gets us closer to the full shape of the human linguistic capacity. Herder and Humboldt's view was aware that languages are not just a means of saying the same thing, but saying it in a different language. The language of a people is developed from their distinctive encounters with the world. And this view, rather than Locke's, can be enriched into a view of language as essential to the full shape of sustainable human flourishing. And it happens that we have one. We have many, and many of them are with our indigenous nations. And such an example comes from a profoundly brilliant collective creation by the Okanagan Syilx Nation. The Syilx Okanagan Language Declaration of 2018, and by the way, we're going to have a chapter in an upcoming book on the language declaration and the development of it and so forth. It comes from 2018. It was signed by all members of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. It contains 20 articles, and here are a few. And I offer them as an example of the concept of language which would be open, as the Lockean view was not open to the possibility of language being constituent of a flourishing life. The Creator stood us, Syilxian speaking people, up here as keepers of our territory, lands, water, and resources for the good of all, for all time. Our Syilxian language is our knowledge of the land, water, and the Timir. The laws related to our territory, lands, water, and resources are held in our Syilxian language. Our high language words have their origin in Chaptik and are foundational to our philosophical, ethical, and legal text. Syilxian is the collective force that connects and unifies the people with all life. Our Syilxian language contains knowledge of our spiritual values and practices as expressed in words and used in our ceremonies to instruct and heal ourselves, our families, our communities, our lands, and our waters. Our Syilxian language will always remind us of these relationships and connections through both our extended kinship and community ties and our associated political kinship structures. Our Syilxian language contains specific words and phrases that provide guidance and instruction on our protocols that govern our peaceful coexistence with other Salishan nations and how we carry on our governance responsibilities within our territory. The conclusion after reading the declaration and after understanding the purpose of it is profoundly decolonizing. And I think that the decolonizing path for all of us includes recognizing that such a declaration is deeply civilizational. It's more than cultural. It comes from knowledge keepers that have been thinking about these issues for 1,000 years or more. It's not absolutely necessary that you, by contrast, take some time to embrace the possibility that mainstream North American civilization is a suicide machine, as Robert Wright says, but it might help. So we need policy and funding, said Lesley Marcom. The story of the federal bill, C-91, which was passed into law last June. And by the way, we're still waiting for it to take effect, but it must by law on October the 1st this year. Bit of a spoiler alert. The bill was supposed to answer Professor Marcom and many others' call for policy with teeth and several calls of action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but, sorry to tell you, it fell short of expectations. But Murray Sinclair, the chief commissioner of the TRC Commission, and now an independent senator and actually sponsor in the Senate of the bill, found himself having to make a very difficult decision on a Thursday evening in June 2019, which was the last day before the Senate had to rise for the summer. And it came down to his decision on what to do with this bill. And he allowed it to pass with all its faults. And he did that because he was able to identify the one thing that the bill did to move Canada a little bit forward on the path to linguistic decolonization. And he said, now we're in the room. So at the end of the final session of the Senate, when the Senate, after having all its amendments, including an all-important Inuit amendment rejected by the House, he was faced with the choice of either no Indigenous language bill at all, or an Indigenous language bill as the government wanted, without significant amendments, without the Inuit amendment. And he had to vote, and the Senate voted with him as follows: the Senate does not insist on its amendments. And therefore the amendments died, but the bill C-91 received royal assent the next day, June 21st, last year. So what's this room? Well, it's the room where Canada's language rights are decided, where inclusions and exclusions are made. Ron Wardoff, in an early book on Canadian language policy, said the Native peoples simply don't fit. How disordered is Canada's linguistic house, and how unwilling Canadians are in general to tidy up the mess. And the wonderful 2015 article by Eve Hack and Donna Patrick, they said, only by recognizing how language policies operate to embed and reinscribe the racial hierarchies at the heart of Canada's ongoing national project can we begin to decolonize the exclusion of Indigenous languages and cultures and peoples in Canada. And I remember speaking to Graham Fraser once. I think I was sitting with Eve here at Glendon, and we were celebrating the 40th year of the Official Languages Act. And after his talk, I think Eve raised her hand and said, just a moment, what about what about non-official languages? And he said basically, well, they die out in a couple of generations, so there's no point in giving them any special constitutional rights. And later at the reception, I asked him, I'm actually working with some people who've been around here for a few more than 3 generations. What about them? And he turned and looked at me and said, really, they don't fit, do they? How true. But maybe Bill C-91 allows people who want to talk about this to come into the room. That's what Senator Sinclair feels. Again, really just go to Eve and Donna's article. Long history of language policy in Canada has led to a hierarchy of belonging in which Indigenous people really don't fit. And Zebedee Nungak said, Canada is an expert in the world, maybe the leading expert in the world on dying and disappearing Indigenous languages. None of our significant experience on official languages for minority speakers trickled over to support endangered languages communities. In fact, they're probably under the same, in the same, literally, building in Ottawa or in Gatineau, but different floors. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, though, idle no more. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. All of these, I think, have begun to turn the wheel. And we're talking about this issue today only because the federal government began to respond to the recommendations, the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm not going to go into all the UNDRIP rights, but Grand Chief Wilden Littlechild appeared before the House Standing Committee and related 13 of them. So there are 13, not just 3, UNDRIP clauses that should be considered as indigenous language rights. But here are some. Under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada and all Anglophone settler states, all 4 of them, New Zealand, Australia, United States, and Canada, originally voted against supporting UNDRIP. Finally, Canada has come around. Of course, New Zealand and Australia have too, but kind of kicking and screaming. Indigenous people have the right to their own institutions, to strengthen their own political, legal institutions, while retaining their right to participate in political and economic life of the country that they happen to be living in. Number 8, Indigenous people and peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation. Number 11, they have the right to revitalize their cultural traditions. Number 13, under UNDRIP, they have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, traditions, and philosophies, writing systems, and literatures. And I think it's number 14 that gets the most attention. And it's the one which, at the moment, is the subject of a complaint to the United Nations, which I will go into later, but it's because the bill that we're looking at, C-91, does not guarantee or enforce the right listed here as UNDRIP 14.1. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish their own educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their own methods of learning and teaching. That, among the people that I'm speaking to, is the right which is primordial. Because, of course, the residential school epoch, well, 150 years is more than an epoch, prevented this from happening. It intentionally broke intergenerational transmission of language and knowledge, and many say the ability to love. 14.2, Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all level of forms of education of the state without discrimination. And number 3, 14.3, is actually quite important in Canada because, as I mentioned, or actually I think it's Lesley Marcom who mentioned, a very large number, maybe a majority, 70% or more of Indigenous people live off reserve. And so 14.3 states that in conjunction with Indigenous peoples taking effective measures, states shall take effective measures in order for Indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, always that hedge, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. This is actually, 14.3 is a point that I had a discussion with Senator Sinclair about, and this is the point that he was very, very worried about, that the federal government was not going to strongly negotiate with provinces that this UNDRIP right be enacted. Number 16 looks at the right to establish their own media. Number 31, the right to protect and develop their heritage and traditional knowledge and traditional culture. 37, the right to recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, and so forth. And the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which came out in December 2015, dovetails with UNDRIP. It states that the federal actions in residential schools constituted cultural genocide to eliminate Indigenous peoples as distinct peoples. Many children died. It sought to erase knowledge and use of mother tongues. And therefore, the call to action number 43, we call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation. This is very, very important. Sinclair also said that the policy denied children an opportunity to find answers to 4 important questions. Who am I? Where have I been? Where am I going? What is my purpose? That is what it is to become a fully fledged human being from the perspective of Indigenous education. And call to action 44, we call on the government of Canada to develop a national action plan to achieve the goals of UNDRIP. Preparing for this talk, I checked the latest statistics from the Yellowhead Institute and others, how many of the 96 calls to action have been acted upon and delivered. It's somewhere between 8 and 9 in the first 5 years of the Trudeau government. In other words, it's happening extremely slowly. The core Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action on Indigenous languages are 13, 14, and 15. 13, we call upon the federal government to acknowledge that Aboriginal rights include Aboriginal language rights. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of this. There is a history of why those rights are expressed the way they are, and how they may well be seen as an empty box, as provinces see them, or a full box, as Indigenous leaders see them. It has yet to be tested in court, whether or not the existing constitutional rights are enforceable. The position that the people I'm working with say is that they're not enforceable. The Canadian Law Association says that they're not enforceable. And however weak C-91 may be, if it only had one more clause that said these rights are enforceable, the Canadian Bar Association would say, yeah, it's a beginning. There's a part of my talk which talks about the question of provincial crowns and how provinces have worked very hard to undermine any potential Indigenous right being established from the federal government, because provinces have the right to tax resource extraction. And resource extraction is fundamentally a provincial power. Today, there's a need to uphold Indigenous jurisdiction and rights after 152 years of internal colonizing pressures of provinces and an absent crown. Okay, I'm not going to get into the weeds on that right now. You can ask about it if you'd like. So back to the narrative, the origin story of this bill. So the Truth and Reconciliation report came out in December 2015. It was in December 2016 at an AGM of the Assembly of First Nations in Ottawa. Trudeau suddenly made a surprise announcement of his government's intention to respond to 3 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, 13, 14, and 15. So Aboriginal rights in 13, Aboriginal legislation in 14, and appointing an Aboriginal language commissioner, 15. He got a standing ovation. And it happened that this was made just 3 weeks after the Glendon Declaration advocating that the government adopt these response to these 3 calls had been taken to Ottawa and discussed at length with high policy officials in the INAC ministry. The Glendon Declaration focused on those 3. We argued for positive rights, enforceable rights. We argued for following the guide of the 2005 task force, and we suggested 3 commissioners, not 1. We don't like the pan-Aboriginal view. We want Inuit distinctiveness, we want Métis distinctiveness, and we want First Nations distinctiveness. That's what we pushed for. And at the same time as the Glendon meeting was happening, the First Peoples Cultural Council of BC also made a pitch with a strong focus on education. The call to action 14 asked the government to follow 5 principles in developing its legislation. It didn't really do that. Call to action 15 asked for the commissioner to be given some teeth. As it turns out, we imagined that the Indigenous Language Commissioner would be similar to the world famous office of the Official Language Commissioner, but our fear was fulfilled, I'm afraid, that the government decided not to make the Indigenous Language Commissioner an officer of Parliament. In fact, the person still to be selected is going to report to the Minister of Heritage. So relatively speaking, it's a very weak commissioner compared to the Official Languages Commissioner. In real time, 2017 was taken up with a co-development process involving Heritage and the 3 national Indigenous organizations. So the AFN, the Association of First Nations, the MNC, the Métis National Council, and Métis Nation of Canada, and the ITK, the Inuit Federation of Inuit Associations. In a paper that has morphed into a chapter of the book project that Amos Key Jr., Maya Chikabi, and I have, I trace the story of how the various themes were made public through the NIOs and through the government, and how they began to diverge after a certain point. The AFN principles, for example, that they articulated at the end of 2017, asked for recognition of the importance of language to land. They asked for the affirmation of UNDRIP rights. They asked for enforceability of individual and collective rights. They wanted institutions, infrastructural institutions, to advance First Nations objectives. They wanted a frank acknowledgement that this was in the context of redressing harms caused by colonization. They wanted First Nations jurisdiction over First Nations languages to take precedence over provinces, for example. And they wanted the government obligations to be articulated quite clearly, so that in dispersing any funds that might flow from this, this legislation, provinces would not be an intermediary between the federal government and Indigenous nations. There was some toing and froing during 2017 about whether or not these principles would be followed. For example, one principle that was developed in 2017 but was never followed was the distinction-based legislation. It seems that under one minister, actually Melanie Joly, the Inuit were given to understand that there would be either a separate Inuit bill or an Inuit annex to the bill, so the Inuit specific legislation would be part of the bill. And that was promised them by one minister, but things do happen, and that never took place. In 2018, this is where Amos and I and Stephanie Pyle were involved in what were called intensive engagement sessions. And the questions that the Heritage Ministry was asking then seemed to be very unfocused and bureaucratic. How best to preserve languages, they asked us. What role should the commissioner be? What are the practical implications of legislating a language right? Would you really feel better in the morning if you had a language right? I mean, it was kind of sophomoric, I'm afraid. And, you know, no disrespect to second-year students, but it really wasn't a very serious set of 6 questions. Anyway, we did our best. I speculate on the gap between the Indigenous organizations and the Department of Canadian Heritage. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission felt from the beginning that Heritage was not the right ministry to be involved. And one thing that I'm absolutely sure about is that the Heritage Ministry, which was originally announced as being the lead ministry, including Indigenous and Northern Affairs, which broke into Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs and Indigenous Services Canada, so CIRNA and ISC. Indigenous Services Canada delivers educational services, for example. They're responsible for education on reserve. And CIRNA is all about nation-to-nation relations with Canada and the potential role of Canada in what they call building or rebuilding nations. And therefore, 2 key themes are absent from this legislation because those 2 ministries were not part of any cross-ministerial dialogue. There's nothing in this bill on nation-to-nation relations. And there's nothing concrete on education, which everybody was asking for in the consultation sessions. And I'm not going deeply into this right now, but one of the reasons that it didn't happen was Jody Wilson-Raybould's Indigenous Rights Framework, which came crashing down around the government's ears, rejected by all 3 national Indigenous organizations, at the same time as the SLN Lavalan scandal was boiling around. The government's plan was to have a huge rights framework, and then the language piece and the child welfare piece would be part of the implementation of the general framework. Unfortunately, the general framework seemed to be a municipalization of Indigenous activities at the local level, rather than any recognition of rights. And of course, it entailed a real threat to Indigenous rights and title. So not at all friendly. Yes, that's more on Jody Wilson-Raybould's governance toolkit. And as I said, that master framework bill was rejected and withdrawn, so that all the cabinet had to move forward on the Indigenous file was C-91 for language and C-92 for child welfare. But the language bill and the child welfare bill were still constructed within the now discredited framework. At any rate, here it was introduced in February with a very handsome Pablo Rodriguez as the new Minister of Canadian Heritage. And he was responded to in Cree by NDP MP from Northern Quebec, from Cree territory in Northern Quebec, Romeo Saganash. And there was a very interesting dialogue in French, English, and Cree for an afternoon in the House of Commons at the beginning of this bill. The initial reception of the bill was very mixed. Some people called it just lip service, no teeth. I should say, Nathan Obed, so the second bubble here, said, yet another legislative initiative developed behind closed doors by a colonial system and then imposed on the Inuit. So basically it was accepted by two Indigenous groups, but rejected by the third. The summary is that the Heritage Ministry will provide adequate long-term funding to reclaim, revitalize, and strengthen Indigenous languages, and therefore must consult with a variety of, quote, Indigenous governing bodies and organizations, and may consult with these entities and with provinces and territories to enter into arrangements or agreements in order to establish a framework and message or measures to support, quote, efforts of Indigenous governing bodies, thereby affirming that Indigenous rights in Section 35 of the Constitution include an unspecified basket of Indigenous language rights. Zebedee Nungaak said, so if I understand correctly, and he's the leader of the Inuit in Nunavik in northern Quebec, what you're saying is that the minister really doesn't have anything to do. He's sitting around twiddling his thumbs, and he needs a piece of legislation to get him to actually consult with Indigenous people. And maybe he will consult to have an arrangement or a recognition of a recognition of a recognition. And he said, well, my language is not English, but it seems to me that recognizing a recognition of a recognition is not really a strong decolonizing move to take. This is such a white page because it is a feast of language policy documentation that only language policy wonks really would love to get into, but there are hundreds of hours of tapes and reports. And what I did, I took all of the 21 written briefs to the standing committee. In another paper, I've done it with the Senate committee, and analyzed their analysis of their response to the bill. So all these wonderful people. And here are some of the wonderful people, some of the illustrious people who now spoke out on C-91 and who are now in the room. I should probably not say there will be a quiz after to see how many of these people you identify, but certainly top left, you have Maya Chikabi now at Glendon, and next to her, a wonderful picture of Amos Key Jr., who is now Vice President of Indigenous Initiatives at Brock. I identified the main themes, and I'll just talk about the first two. These were the main complaints from all the people who appeared before the committee. Relationship issues are problematic. 5 people were opposed to provincial agreements, and the rights are weak and unspecified. So those were the 2 main areas. The relationship between Canada and Indigenous people is murky in this bill, and the bill doesn't help to clarify things. And secondly, there are no rights that can be enforced in any court. So my thesis, exactly that. Relationship issues, rights issues are 2 serious limits to full linguistic decolonization. And the Inuit, who I guess are the people that I feel closest to, were just left out in the cold, as they say. They were the most outspoken on the colonial nature of the act. For example, they wanted to end the gross funding inequality with French in Nunavut. Many Indigenous people take the Official Languages Act and policies relating to supporting French communities outside of Quebec as a funding model to perhaps be followed. But the gross inequality in Nunavut between the amount that goes to a Francophone student and the amount that goes to an Inuit student in their own territory is expressed here. And it is not, I think, the intention of the official language policy of Canada that that be the case. I could get into amendments, but I'm not going to in this talk. The conclusion, I think, is you can get into the room, but you can't get into the room with enforceable rights. And so Indigenous language rights are far behind official language rights. I have a vision of the room, but it's only my vision. It needs action. I would like all Indigenous languages to flourish as the Okanagan language, who are an example of a nation that are not waiting around for the federal government to grant them any rights or funding. They're doing it on their own. I would like the room to be eventually full of Indigenous language speakers of all ages and on an equal footing. In other words, truly decolonized with respect to language. And of course, it's so much more than just a federal responsibility. And I don't want that, and I'm sure the TRC people don't want that to be the impression in the public. All of us are treaty people in some respect. And so provincial governments, municipal governments, sports teams, artists, filmmakers, business groups, NGOs, individuals of all ages, and especially schools and post-secondary educational institutions, all of us can become allies and get in touch with somehow with people in your area, be guided by and listen to Indigenous people in your territory. I'm amazed at the University of Waterloo, which requires all its undergrads to take a course on allyship as part of their general education. And Glendon, let's have a shout out for Glendon. Glendon is doing its part. Apart from being the home of the fabulous Canadian Language Museum with its exhibits on Cree and Nuktut and plans for other languages to come forward soon. This fall, Glendon will discuss and hopefully adopt 2 decolonizing, indigenizing proposals from the Common Core Curriculum Committee. So a shout out to Lee Frew and Lise Veers. One of the required content areas for all Glendon students to take include decolonization and indigenization content. And from the working group on recruitment and retention, a proposal for 2 of 4 degree streams, a plurilingual foundations proposal in which beyond English and French students would choose 2 additional languages, one of which would be Indigenous, and the Indigenous language we teach at Glendon is Anishinaabemowin. And also we have to get ready. The United Nations Declaration on Indigenous People did eventually set up a year of Indigenous languages in 2019, and in a way, C-91, with all its faults, was leveraged into action by always remembering, always citing, and telling the federal government that Canada has to do something. It's a year of Indigenous languages. And then the UN went back to New York and heard from people about how the effect of that year was important, but still limited. And then later in 2019, the UN declared that Indigenous languages really need a decade. And the decade for Indigenous languages starts in a year's time, in 2022, and will go for 10 years. So I think, my point here, York University, why not design a 10-year action plan for Indigenous knowledges and languages, especially now that we have a brand new organized research unit to take this on. And thanks to Yann Lalard-Tremblay, Ruth Colazar-Green, and Elaine Coburn for being the leads on that initiative. And let's try to envision a decolonizing university. I'm not saying decolonized, I'm saying decolonizing. It's a process. It's not a sprint. It's a long marathon in which Indigenous knowledges and languages are a normalized part of every faculty, of every discipline, of every student's experience, so that York could be a worthy educational institution for and with and by those nations who are cited in our language acknowledgement. Let's have more Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe students at York, but let's make York a welcoming place for them. And if I were skilled, I would finish this by playing a song written by a student in a school under the education faculty partnership that the St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish has with the Mi'kmaq Nation in Nova Scotia. One of their students, a grade 10 student named Emma Stevens, translated and sings Paul McCartney's Blackbird. And you don't have time, but I would suggest that when you get a moment today, Google Emma Stevens' Blackbird and listen to it. The line that I think is most famous is this one that translates the lines, "All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. And I think we are at a moment. It's a long moment, thanks to TRC and UNDRIP and I Don't Know More, and maybe a change in Canada's understanding of itself, historians such as Ian McKay and others, and initiatives from really strong and determined First Nations such as the Inuit, the Okanagan, the Anishinaabe. And therefore, I think my talk is over, and I hope it's stimulated thought, that's all, and done no harm. Thank you.
Merci Ian, c'est en effet très stimulant, very stimulating.